All right, good morning. Let's take a seat. We're going to get rolling. All right, welcome. Welcome to the village. Continue our study in Ecclesiastes. You guys can hear me all right? Sounds okay? Yeah, Ecclesiastes 3. This is going to be fun. Really have been enjoying our Ecclesiastes studies. So we'll go ahead and start with some prayer. A couple of you want to pray, and then we'll get started. Yeah. Yeah. Yeah, I agree with all those things, Lord. Help us to dial in this morning and engage with this text. It's really fascinating, interesting, beautiful text, and I pray that you would teach us through it as we consider what you have to say to us. So, thanks for time together. Amen. All right. So Ecclesiastes 3, we're going to jump right in. We're going to read the whole chapter today. It's 22 verses. It's not that much. But hopefully you've been with us. I'll remind us about kind of overview type things as we go and different things like that. But we're just going to jump right in. So here we go, Ecclesiastes 3. There is an appointed time for everything, and there is a time for every event under the sun, a time to give birth and a time to die, a time to plant and a time to uproot what is planted, a time to kill and a time to heal, a time to tear down and a time to build up, a time to weep and a time to laugh, a time to mourn and a time to dance. And I think there's some unspoken rule whenever you look at this text that we have to hear from the birds. You know the song, right? It was like, whoa. Again, yeah, you know the song, right? You have to play the birds when you read this. That Solomon didn't know when he wrote this that he would have a hit in 1965. It's a great song, and it's definitely from this passage, and so that's cool. All right, so let's read it. There's an appointed time for everything, and there's a time for every event under heaven. If you recall that phrase under heaven, it's synonymous with under the sun. We spent some time a couple weeks ago in the intro talking about what that meant. And really think of that as it's a marker of time. It's referring to life on this earth, life as it's characterized just in the view under heaven. And so that's kind of the flavor of what's going on there. Time to give birth, the time to die, time to plant, time to uproot what's planted. So what we have here, these are pairing of opposites: time to kill, time to heal, tear down, building up. And what's interesting, and it goes on, there's 8 verses that have these pairings. And you'll see as we go on, but many of these, just pay attention as we read them, a lot of them have to do with relationship between people. Not all of them, but many of them have to do with our experiences in life, especially with other people. And part of the point of pairing things that are opposites, it's this style of writing, it's this way of saying, it's the time that you were born, the time that you die, and kind of everything in between. It's referring to everything that's kind of captured between these opposites. And so that's really the flavor. As you read this, you want to be thinking it's a time to weep, a time to laugh, and all the human experiences that we have relationally in between that. It's a really beautiful way of expressing kind of what the human experience is like. And we go on, a time to throw stones, and a time to gather stones, a time to embrace, a time to shun embracing. The throwing stones and gathering stones is easily the most vague reference here, and it's not really clear exactly what this is referring to. There's some good options. What I thought of when I read this was my boys, Abe and Jack, gathering and scattering stones repeatedly, smashing my nice rocks, my, landscaping rocks with sledgehammers. That's what I had in mind, but I'm pretty sure that's not what Solomon had in mind when he wrote this. So some commentators think, the gathering and scattering, it could be referring to building up and kind of tearing down, but that's like, it's kind of repetitive though, because they would have been taking these stones out of fields, maybe to plow them. So maybe gathering them in that sense, preparing a field or something, building with those stones. Yeah, maybe that sounds good. Cultivating fields. There's some other interesting ones about like ritually pure and sexual relations between man and wife. And it's like, there's a whole article written about how I don't think that it's a critique on that. Doesn't seem like that's the right interpretation here. I think it's kind of vague. Clearly it's opposites, gathering and scattering. I don't know, Abe and Jack, they gather and they scatter. That's what comes to mind, but it contributes to, a lot of frustration in my life as my human experience of life. It really pisses me off. But anyway, we don't need to go on anymore about that. I don't know what it's referring to. Time to search and a time to give up is lost. Time to keep and throw away. Oh yeah, I need to throw away more stuff. I'm a hoarder of sorts. And we go through these periods where there are times where we really have to search diligently for things. And this could be referring to any manner of things that we have to search for. Jason's probably searching for his wallet most days. I'm losing my sunglasses constantly, and my wife seems to find them quickly. But time to search, time to give up. This is just capturing these rhythms of life, these different seasons that we're in. And sometimes we just need to throw in the towel and say the thing's lost, whatever that is. Time to tear apart and a time to sew together, a time to be silent, time to speak. We have these opposites. And then the last one, a time to love and a time to hate, a time for war and a time for peace. And so what's interesting about these first 8 verses, it's a fairly famous section, primarily because of the birds, but it's well known, and you might even hear this, the first 8 verses here at a funeral, even for a naturalist or a humanist, that it's kind of a beautiful poetic expression of what life under the sun, what the human experience is like. And what was really fascinating to me as I read this, if you don't have it in front of you, it's okay, it's going to be up in a second. But verse 9, you never hear verse 9 in this kind of rhythm of things. It's very interesting. I'll get there in a second. But this is how Gibson, this is that Living Life Backward book that's been mentioned. This is his summary of kind of these first 8 verses. Life is complex, full of good times, hard times, and a whole manner of lifestyle choices and decisions that often require wisdom that seems to escape us. Remember, we're in wisdom literature. And so as we go through here, we should be expecting some commentary on what it means to live wisely in light of what was just said. And so we'll see that play out a little bit. But life is complex. We have these polar opposites paired together on all the things that happen in between. Very interesting. And then we get to verse 9, and it just feels like what a cold, hard question after this beautiful expression. What profit is there to the worker from that in which he toils? Like, what have you gained? Remember this word profit, it's what's left over. What have you gained? You experience all these rhythms, these opposites, these good times, bad times, this complicated human experience, and what have you gained? This made me think of, I'm the director of our PhD program. I sit in a lot of these dissertation proposals and defenses. And I have a colleague who is like opposite temperament of me. A lot of you know her. Very smiley and bubbly. And so a student will like present and she'll be like, that was awesome. And she'll say, I love how you said this and this and this. And it's all really warm and fuzzy. And then I'm like, and what about this thing? And it's like cold water. It's like there's this warm fire building and it's happy and it's great. And that's kind of what the first 8 verses feel like. Like it's, oh, this is really beautiful. And then all of a sudden, verse 9, it's like, oh man, cold water on a fire. What have you gained? And we never hear that part at funerals for sure, because the implied answer is nothing. You've gained nothing under the sun in all these experiences. And it draws on themes that we've seen earlier, because you're dead, you're not there, and you'll be forgotten. That's kind of what our preacher is telling us. And then he goes on. I have seen the task which God has given the sons of men with which to occupy themselves. He's made everything appropriate in its time. He's also set eternity in their heart, yet so that man will not find out the work which God has done from the beginning even to the end. This is, I didn't mention this, this is NASB translation, and I think it's especially confusing, verse 11. But verse 11 is really key. We're going to come back to that, but we're going to keep reading right now. I know that there's nothing better for them than to rejoice and do good in one's lifetime. Moreover, that every man who eats and drinks seeds good in all his labor. It's the gift of God. I'll just pause there briefly. Recall, some people interpret Ecclesiastes as this is just a life apart from God. And I mentioned in that introduction that that's not necessarily, because actually the preacher will think about life under the sun, and then he'll bring in references to God and say, but God has given purpose. There's these things that God's given, so it's not completely devoid of a God worldview, a theistic worldview. I know that everything God does will remain forever. There's nothing to add to it, and there's nothing to take from it. For God has so worked that men should fear Him. That word fear, it's like hold in awe, revere. That this is that God has done these things so that people will stand in awe of who He is. That which so here's a quick comment. We'll come back to this too. The fact that God remains forever, this is actually very key to this whole argument that there is meaning and purpose in our lives, because we're not around, we're not going to see what happens after we're gone. We'll be forgotten, but God doesn't forget. God is still there, and we'll see a few more points on that coming up. That which is has been already, and that which will be has already been. For God seeks what has passed by. Things that have happened, they've come to pass. The point is God's kind of had a hand in this. God's been there. He's been there for all of that. Furthermore, I've seen under the sun that in the place of justice, there's wickedness. In the place of righteousness, there is wickedness. I said to myself, God will judge both the righteous man and the wicked man. For a time, for every matter, and for every deed is there. So it's sticking with this theme. There's an appointed time, a designated time for all these things to occur. There's also a designated time for this, that God's going to judge. And this is really because this is true, that we'll all give an account for our lives. This means justice will be served. That's very comforting on the one hand. And it also means our actions, life under the sun, it matters. What we do in this life matters because God is there. And there is a designated time for Him to pass judgment. We're not there yet, but it's coming. Verse 18, I said to myself concerning the sons of men, God has surely tested them in order for them to see that they are but beasts. For the fate of the sons of men and the fate of the beasts is the same. As one dies, so dies the other. Indeed, they all have the same breath, and there's no advantage for man over beast, for all is vanity. You remember that word vanity, hopefully, Habel, or Havel. Fleeting, of a vapor, of breath, it's there and gone. And the question kind of hangs, well, what was the point of that? It's all vanity, is what the preacher says that a ton in this book. All go to the same place, all came from the dust, and all return to the dust. Who knows that the breath of man ascends upward, and the breath of the beast ascends downward to the earth? I have seen that nothing is better that man should be happy in his activities, for that is his lot. For who will bring him to see what will occur after him? What's he saying? No one's going to bring you around to see what's happened. You're dead, you're gone. So who will bring the implied answer? No one will bring you around, you're dead. You can't see what's going on. So that's our chapter. Those are our verses that we're working through. But remember, there's a couple of things we should note here. Solomon's an excellent teacher. These questions, we want to keep that in mind. So when he's saying, who knows that the breath of man ascends upward, the breath of beast ascends downward. I didn't mention the breath of man, that's the word is usually translated spirit. So it's think of your soul, spirit. So who knows? He's posing the question, are we any different than the animals? Do we know that the human spirit ascends, goes on living, and the beast does not? I mean, that's kind of the flavor there. He's asking these questions, he's posing these questions. And if you remember my example, I had this great professor at Ohio State, and we would just show up to class. There were three of us, and she would just ask questions the whole time, and that was our class. And it was amazing because her questions were so packed that it was challenging to answer. But as we kind of worked out the answers, we were learning. That's exactly what the preacher's doing here. He's posing questions. He's saying, who knows these things? Is this the case? What do you know? You're not going to be here to see what happens after. And the whole point is to make us reflect on this certainty. And think about how this is paired with all of the seasons and the change that happens and the uncertainty. One thing I didn't point out in those first 8 verses, there's no like natural progression of thought. There's no like order to it. And I think that's part of the point, that it's unpredictable. You can't order these things. You don't know when you're going to be in a time of mourning and a time of happiness. You don't know. You don't know how life's going to play out like that. Compare that to the certainty. You're definitely all of us, we are going to die. So these things are held up to get us thinking, to get us reflecting on the certainty of death. And this is something that I think we're really good at avoiding, this type of way of thinking. We love distracting ourselves. We love finding other things to occupy ourselves with so we don't have to reflect on these things. And that stands in contrast to the preacher's perspective. He summarizes it really nicely later on in this book in Ecclesiastes 7. He says, it's better to go to a house of mourning than to go to a house of feasting, because that is the end of every man, and the living takes it to heart. So why is he saying that? Why does he say it's better? We should ask ourselves these questions when he makes claims like this. Why is it better? Well, the point seems to be because there's more to be learned by considering death and learning how to live wisely than it is to go to a house of partying. That you learn more about what it means to live a wise life by considering these things, by thinking about something that's really unpleasant to think about. It's interesting. So I think that's a good summary statement. And really, I think the crux, the thesis of this whole chapter is really back in verse 11. So we had those first 8 verses that are really beautiful about how God has made things. He's set aside these times for these different things to happen in the human experience. And verse 11, he says this, just reminding you here. He's made everything appropriate in its time. He's also set eternity in their heart, yet so that man will not find out the work which God has done from the beginning even to the end. That's a tongue twister, that particular phrase. He's made everything appropriate. The word here, Yafeh, I think is how it's pronounced. It's fair, it's beautiful, fitting. A lot of translations actually go with beautiful here, which I thought was kind of interesting. The point seems to be that God is in control. He stands outside time, that he has put together the human experience in such a way that it is beautiful, it's fitting, it's appropriate, even though it's really complicated. And it's not exactly how it was intended to be. We're experiencing the effects of being separated from God, according to the Bible. But he knows precisely. We don't know from where we sit how things play out. We don't know how these things are arranged together, but God does. He sits outside time. He knows how these are going to play out. And then he has this beautiful phrase here. He set eternity in their heart. What does that mean? He said eternity. Eternity is like this sense of everlasting, that there's something about the human experience that we were meant for lasting significance, ultimate meaning, not meant for separation. I think we see this all over the place. I think we naturally have a desire for meaning. We, as humans, ask ourselves these questions. Is there more to life? Is there any meaning? Or at least we should ask ourselves these questions. This is one thing that sets us apart. He asked the question earlier, are we any different than the animals and the beasts? You could argue, yeah, we are, because we are able to reflect. We're conscious. We can reflect on these types of questions. Animals don't do that. But we have this sense that there must be more, and we long for it. The other place this plays out, this idea of setting eternity, this sense in our heart, is this sense that we have that death is really unnatural. This is a very unnatural experience. I think this is, in my opinion, some of the strongest evidence for the biblical worldview. I think the way that Christianity answers the question about death, what it is, why it happens, and should it happen, I think that's the most satisfying answer out there that's available. Because let's just put on the naturalist lens for a moment. if we are truly here as a random occurrence in nature, that humans have just evolved this way, we've developed, we've somehow gone from, inorganic, impersonal beings to being aware of ourselves, conscience, being able to relate to people. If this has just all happened, it seems that death would be fairly natural. It's just part of the natural rhythms of life. There's death and there's birth, and this is how it goes. But as soon as you experience the death of someone that you love, you're like, you have this sense that this is not right. Why should we have to be separated like this? We have a sense that, no, we're meant for more. We're not meant for this. We shouldn't have to say goodbye to our loved ones. Why would we feel like this if that is how it is and how it should be? I think this is easily one of the strongest pieces just of, does the worldview presented in the Bible, does that line up with our human experience? I think death is a very interesting and important area to consider. I want to go to what Jesus had to say about this. This is out of John 11. And if you're familiar, there's a dude named Lazarus, and he was really sick, and they had come to Jesus and they're like, hey, your buddy Lazarus is really sick. You should come down here. And sorry, this is in my way here. Gotta put this down. And so they ask him to come down, and we're just going to pick up and just read these couple verses. It says, when Mary reached the place where Jesus was and saw him, she fell at his feet. So he came down to where Lazarus was. And Lazarus has died at this point. Lord, if you had been there, my brother would not have died. And in 33, when Jesus saw her weeping and the Jews who had come along with her also weeping, he was deeply moved in spirit and troubled. And it goes on to say, and he wept, and Jesus wept over what was happening here. But the part that I didn't know for years until somebody had pointed it out in a teaching, this phrase, deeply moved in his spirit and troubled, you just think, well, Jesus is very sad. It goes on to say that he cried and stuff. That's not what it means. It means, feel advanced. He was very angry. He was very angry. This deep movement in his spirit, he was angry, moved with indignation. It's like outrage. And I just think this is so fascinating. Why would Jesus be outraged? Why would he be outraged? Because it's not meant to be like this. He's pissed because humans shouldn't have to experience this. You weren't meant for this. That's the point. That's why he's deeply moved in his spirit, that he sees the grief and the sadness of people being parted from people that they love. And he's like, it shouldn't be like this. And that's why he's pissed. Man, what a different understanding of that passage. It's not natural. It's not meant to be like this. And that's why considering our death is a way to understand and move towards an understanding of who God is, because it's not meant to be like this. And we should face that. And then this is the really confusing couple verses here. Yet so that man will not find out the work, which, okay, NLT says it very simply and nicely. But even so, people can't see the whole scope of God's work. This fits in very nicely. And it's just a clear, I think, translation of the meaning here. So what's the preacher telling us? God has set these things. He's made life beautiful in its own way, and it's time. And there's going to be a time set aside for judgment too. But he's given humans a sense of eternity in their hearts. It's just hardwired into us that we're not meant for life to be like this as it is under the sun right now. But even though we have this sense, we don't have the full view. We're not outside time like God is. We can't see how everything fits together. And it's worth mentioning here, Heidi and I have this conversation all the time, I feel like. It's easy to read something like this where, so God he's in control, he's outside time, and maybe he's orchestrated everything. So does that mean everything that happens is exactly what he wants to happen? I think that's where we really have to hold in balance some of the other teaching where the world is fallen, not as God intended. And sometimes things are a result of just people making terrible decisions and hurting each other and the brokenness of life as it is under the sun. And we have to hold those things in tension. That I don't think that means there's a reason, like a good reason, that God had some intention for every bad thing that happens in your life. He will use those things according to the Bible, that he wants to use those things for good in your life, and he can make good things come of it. But that's a very different sense than like he's making those things happen because it all fits in. Like, no, he's able to orchestrate in the midst of brokenness. And I think if that feels like a tension, it should feel like a tension, because that's the tension we experience when we read the Bible's account of how the world works. So we have this sense that we're meant for more, but we can't see the whole picture. And so there's going to be tension there. I think this gives us a lot of hope if I think about it, that I can't see the full picture. I think this season that I'm in is really difficult, or there's a lot of injustices that are happening or whatever. But we can rest assured that there is someone who sees the whole picture and understands it, and there is a time set aside to give account for that. It's not just going to go unnoticed and forgotten. So let's summarize here. There's a time for everything. That's clearly part of the preacher's point here, that we run into these different seasons, that life's really complicated, and there's different times. These different seasons that we're going to experience as part of the human life. It's good, it's bad, it's really complicated, and all sorts of things. I hope you notice that in those pairings. Not all of them are obviously good and obviously bad. Some of them are just, it's time to embrace and then not embrace. Maybe that's just appropriate sometimes, and that's part of living wisely. We're not in control of things, but God is. God is outside of time, so he has a totally different perspective. I think that's really critical that we understand that. And then because there will be judgment, our actions have meaning and significance. This is part of the point, that we need to learn God's perspective here, that the things that we experience in life, the things we're upset about, the things that we rejoice about, God sees all of these things. And there's a time set aside, designated for him to revisit those things. This is how David Gibson summarizes this section, this whole chapter, and I really like it. He says, living well in God's world means recognizing that when it comes to our own lives, we're not many gods. And this is his creation, not ours. We have all the pieces of our life given to us, and things come and go, and seasons change, and it's only God who knows exactly where everything is meant to go, in which order, what time, and why. So I would just qualify a little bit with that why, with what I said a few minutes ago, that there are, like, part of the why is that, well, this has happened because it's a really broken world, and it sucks. And that, to me, is as far as sometimes the why explanation goes. But I really like that. And I didn't really highlight it, but in the text, that middle part, we have all the pieces of our life given to us. You really get the sense, I didn't emphasize it, that the part of living wisely is to view what we do have in the midst of these different seasons as a gift, that we're not entitled to it, that time is limited, and that part of our experience should be reflecting on that as gratitude towards God for what we do have, and the times that we do get to experience that are meaningful, worthwhile, and all that. And in this particular chapter, David really points out how many of the struggles, the difficult times we have in our lives, relate to not thinking clearly about this exact topic, that we want to know why things are happening, why it's happening to me in this particular season. We get really frustrated when we don't have really clear answers about all that. Part of living wisely is accepting that we're not always going to have the full picture. That is definitely part of the preacher's point here. That we're usually, part of our dissatisfaction comes from not having clear answers about why these things are happening. And we can live more wisely by accepting our perspective and understanding that God has a different and more full perspective. So let's think about some application, how we can apply some of the principles that are being taught here. Time is limited. That's clearly part of the point. Time is mentioned, I don't know how many times, over 20 times, I think, in the chapter. And we would do well to think clearly about time. One of the most obvious points is we aren't going to be here forever. That's clearly the point of a lot of the writing in Ecclesiastes. And so we should make the most of it. New Testament reinforces this as well. Colossians, make the most of every opportunity, make the best use of time is kind of the flavor there. And I think we can think about this from how as maybe Christians we can use time well, how as non-Christians we can use our time well. Because you might be here uncertain, what you think of God. And really the point from the passage is there is this designated time for God to judge. That's uncomfortable, I think, to say that there is a higher power that we're accountable to because he's the creator. That should sit uncomfortably. It's meant to, and that is part of the point of what the preacher writes. It's meant to be uncomfortable. He's asking these questions, posing these questions, and are we ready? So according to the Bible, the way you get ready for this is by understanding who Jesus is and accepting that God's created a way for you to be reconciled to him. He'll come into your life, reconcile broken relationships, especially the broken relationship that you have with God, that we were meant to be in a relationship with God. And because we decided we didn't want his leadership in our lives, that's broken. And that has caused all sorts of problems. And so part of being ready is to understand God's offer because it's on the table. And the only thing that's going to keep you from being reconciled is your own decision. And so making the most of time if you're here as a non-Christian is to continue to make progress in understanding what is this offer? What is this worldview that is on the table? And just passively sitting back and not making a decision is a no decision. We have to actively move towards something. If you're not going to take on maybe the biblical worldview, you're going to have another worldview, and you're going to orient your life around that. And so making the most of time is being ready for this. So we want to consider that. It's uncomfortable, but it should be. I mean, these are weighty things to consider. I think especially as I was studying this, thinking about how my use of time lines up with things that God values, things that are going to last into eternity. There are definitely things that we need to and have to spend time on that are not going to be super meaningful in the long run. But there are other things that we can do that is extremely meaningful. I teach investments, and so it's helpful to think about this from my perspective. Like, what are we investing in that's going to reap benefit in the future? It's not like finding the next Amazon would be really cool, but at the end of the day, then I'm going to die and I'll be forgotten. So I mean, that's Ecclesiastes talking to us. Like, what's it matter that I found the next Amazon? No, I should invest in something that's going to last into eternity. According to the Bible, what are those things that last into eternity? It's relationships with people. It's you guys. It's helping people understand who God is. And we're not spending time on it this morning, but there's this whole beautiful study to get into about what it's going to be like in eternity. We're going to be welcomed into each other's homes and realize the people that we've had an impact on in this life. God wants us to participate in that and be part of building relationships with people that are going to last into eternity. That's the stuff that's going to last. That's cool. Let's get into that. So if we're going to, investing in organizations, people that are out there sharing. As a church, we support groups overseas. Like that's going to last. We're going to reap dividends on that. We want to be investing with an eternal sort of perspective. The other thing I want to say about this, I haven't done it in a long time. I for a while was in the habit of just tracking time. There's like lots of apps for this. Toggle's one, but like you can just track how you spend your time. And I think many of us often feel like I don't have time. I say this all the time. I don't have time for that. And some of that might be true, but you really don't know unless you've actually studied how you spend your time. It's very eye-opening. I highly recommend it. If you haven't done this for a while, I haven't done it for a while. I've been out of tracking time for at least 10 months or more. And I highly recommend that you do this. You'll find that there are pockets of the day where I end up wasting 20 minutes scrolling on whatever your flavor is. 20 minutes here, 30 minutes there, it's a big deal. And so if we want to take this seriously, understanding that our time is limited, and there are things that we could be doing with our time that are going to last into eternity, let's study how we spend our time. Let's do a good job using our time. I think that's really critical. All right, another application here. seasons come and go. And what I mean, not just like fall and winter, that's not what I'm talking about. Seasons of life, that's the flavor of the first 8 verses. Of course, I love the seasons. Happy when I see the leaves turning, it's awesome. But seasons of life, difficult times, hard times, stations of life. I'm single and I'd like to be married. I'm married and we'd like to have kids. We have kids, we're ready for them to move out. Like, it's like there are all these seasons of life, and they're going to come and go. And part of the point is you're not always going to be in this season that you're in right now, because they come and go. So, but like letting that inform our perspective is fairly challenging, because it feels like this is never going to end. I felt like that when my kids were little, and it was the 2-hour bedtime routine grind with little ones, and they're freaking out, losing their minds. I think Derek would call it like crazy train. When our kids were little, like everybody's on the crazy train between 5 and 7 every night. And you do that for years and you're like, this is never going to change. And I've not slept in 8 years or whatever. Like you feel like you're out of your mind. But Ecclesiastes says it's a season. It's not always going to be like this. And it's very true. Now we leave our kids at home and go to happy hour. It's like, you guys are all right. We're out of here. It's great. And so part of the point here is we need to learn to appreciate the season that we're in, because it's not always going to be this season. And I think that's just a really tangible, practical point, that it's a gift of God. The season that you're in right now, you have different availability than you're going to have in a different season. You're learning different things about yourself, about other people, about God in this season than you would in another season. And so holding on to that and letting our perspective be informed by the preacher here is just to know that I'm in this season. It's not always going to be this season. I think that's very helpful, very important. I think we have a whole nother set of application questions, or I guess application concepts about dealing with death. We would be remiss to not address this. We have to face this. This is, of all the uncertainties about the timing and the length and the extent of the seasons that we experience in life, this is the one thing that you can definitely expect. You are going to die. All of us will. And so we should let that inform our perspective and help us live wisely. So it's meant to spur us to action. So just think about where you're at right now in your journey with God. What does understanding your death have to do with your next step moving forward with God? Maybe it's as simple as the stuff we said earlier. I need to use my time better. I need to be investing in the things that are going to be around, last into eternity. That would be a wise way to live. I'm not going to regret that. Maybe it's the next step is I need to understand more about who this Jesus guy is, what God has to say. If God in the Bible is true, the one that's there, I should know some things about that. I mean, that would apply to all of us. If we're going to be spending eternity, with this Creator, it makes a lot of sense to understand what we've been given so far. Yeah, so let those questions, just let them linger and let it spur you to action. And we could say without a doubt, denying this, the fact of our death, whether it's actively or passively, so actively in the sense that like there are people that are actively denying the reality of their own death. Have you heard about there's like you can pay tons of money and have your body frozen so that once science reaches the point they can like bring you back to life and fix whatever was ailing you and stuff. You'll pay like hundreds of thousands of dollars for this. You can look at the beauty cosmetic industry. There are all these therapies available to help your hair not look like you're going towards your death, or your skin to not look like you're going towards your death. We're inevitably trying to delay this. It's just going to happen. And so we don't want to deny this. Let that reality sink in, and then let that inform the way we live our lives. That's the point. That's good stuff. And I think it's super comforting to know this is not natural. Death shouldn't be this way. Experiencing the loss of a loved one and realizing that what I'm experiencing is normal. It's right from God's perspective, that I should be feeling this way. And there's great hope because, Christianity is one of the only worldviews that offers real hope of being reunited with those loved ones. That's incredibly awesome that this is really unnatural that we experience this separation right now, but it's temporary. Like if we're both reconciled to God as Christians, we're going to be reunited and we won't have this separation any longer. That's awesome. Very cool. So it can really inform our perspective. It obviously also brings up, as you experience the death of loved ones who don't know God, that's obviously unbelievably painful, and we shouldn't gloss over that. Yeah, I mean, it's tragic. It's really sad. But what do we do with that? Well, we need to make good use of the time. We need to be investing, doing our part, the extent that we can, to help people understand that it doesn't have to be like this. God's offering you a path to forgiveness. Those are heavy, weighty things. But that's what I got for us. And now we got some time for questions. So what questions, comments do we have? Brought back to White. Yeah, Bill. No way. Look at that. Yeah. Yeah. Mm-hmm. It's very sobering. Being in that environment, it's like all the ways that we convince ourselves this isn't going to happen or distract ourselves from thinking about this, it all comes into clarity as you experience that. Mm. Mm-hmm. Yeah. Mm. Yeah. That's really interesting. Yeah. Well, you just lived that experience, that chapter 7, verse 2, that it's more productive. You learn a lot more being around people that are mourning, because it clarifies what are the real issues in life. I mean, you're not thinking about unimportant things typically at a funeral. You're reflecting on, yeah, what is most important. That's really interesting. Thanks for sharing that. Yeah. Oh, Bill, were you gonna say something else? Yeah. 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 I can try, but well, let's come back. Maybe there's some other comments around that. Let's come back to that topic. I think that's good. Yeah. Uh-huh. Yeah. Yeah. Mm-hmm. Hmm. Yeah, that's a good picture. Mm-hmm. Yeah. 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 Right. Yeah. Right. Yeah. And that's the perspective that the preacher's really giving there, that like part of living wisely is to accept our limitations and understanding that. I'm glad you mentioned that verse. And I think the whole book really stands in contrast to like the book of Proverbs, where it sounds like if you generally do these things and it generally works out well. Ecclesiastes is like, but what happens when it's not like that? And it's not like that. Yeah. Go ahead. Thanks for sharing. Yeah. He really liked Lazarus. Right. All right. Yeah. 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 The unexplained, like, why would it be like this? Yeah. Good point. Yeah. We'll go Thomas and then Vicky. Uh-huh. Yeah. Yeah. That's great description. Yeah. Hmm. I think that's awesome. I'm glad you shared that image. I didn't share that as that is really the flavor. I think that's a perfect illustration of like what Jesus' reaction was. So I think even that, like very angry, it doesn't really do justice. Like he's ready to charge, pissed. Yeah, I love that. That's really good. And what that communicates about, yeah, how God feels about our experiences and us as individuals. I love that. Yeah. Vicky, it's the best teacher, right? It's okay. Yeah. Yeah, well, I think it broadly, and so do you mean like especially for Christians? Yeah, so for Christians, what's the implication that God will hold things to account? That's a great question. So besides, I think a number of things, but things that come to mind, knowing that there's accountability in the future helps us with the different seasons of life and different injustices that we see. We're going to hear more from Corey on that next week because now chapter 4 gets into the oppression and the terrible things that happen in life. And like, so I think that perspective is very helpful living in this life and just reconciling these things. But then too, the broader point is because there's accountability for things that happen in this life under the sun, that means that our actions have lasting significance and meaning because they are remembered by God who's outside time, and he revisits these things. In some sense, very positive. The New Testament, we don't, I'll just state it briefly and it's not going to be adequate, but New Testament teaches that as Christians, we'll appear before like it's like an awards ceremony, the Bema Seat judgment. Like God's going to recognize the meaningful things that happened under the sun in this life that have implications for eternity. And in the new heavens, the new earth that's going to be created, that we're given differing levels of responsibility in that new world, rewards. I mean, it's not coincidence that we're really motivated by rewards. If I tell my students in my class, like, we have this guest speaker, I'd really like for you to be there. It's like, all right. If I'm like, there's 15 extra credit points on that one assignment if you go to that guest speaker, like, all right, and they go. It's because we're hardwired for incentive, and that's not that can feel kind of like, oh, is that grubby or something? Like the only reason I'm doing this? No, it's hardwired. Like we should be motivated by reward. So there is a sense that like as Christians we're rewarded for the things that we do in this life. So those are the things that come to mind. I'm not sure if that's helpful. Yes, exactly. It helps us cope, I think, in this life, knowing that God's going to hold these things accountable. I don't need to. It's not my role. It's God's. Yeah. Were you going to say something about that?
Would it be enough so if you went back to 3 verses like 10?
No. 10, well, they're on different slides, but 10 through 13, close enough.
Yeah, so it's interesting because this subject of considering death, considering these are big philosophical weighty subjects. And some conclusion is like the most practical, simple. There's nothing better than the choice to do good in a lifetime. Every man who eats and drinks is good and all gift of God. Like,
yes,
it's a very practical. I think there's a tension between making the most of your time and enjoying life.
Yeah, that's good.
Some of us, maybe enjoying. I tend towards enjoying myself too much and not making use of time and wasting time. Some people tend towards maybe trying to make too much of the time and earn whatever.
Yes.
And they don't.
Yeah.
So, it's just
I think that's really fair.
The conclusion is you're going to die. There's a good God, so enjoy life for what it is.
Mm-hmm.
And then when you know that like the thing you're enjoying isn't going to ultimately do, you actually can enjoy it.
You can appreciate it. Yeah. Yeah.
Enjoy my life. She's not my God. I enjoy her more because she's not the ultimate.
Totally. Yeah, I think that's I think that's really good. I'm glad you pointed that out, because that is a tension. Some of us are going to be prone to like, well, if there's not some intensely meaningful purpose to this particular interaction, I'm not going to engage, or like I don't have time for that. But like, no, part of the perspective is we have these different rhythms in life. We want to use our time well, but we can also just appreciate the good things God's given, and that's beautiful and that's awesome. Yeah, I'm glad you pointed that out. It's really good. We have time for one more if we have one. Otherwise, we can pray. Yeah, go ahead, Derek. Oh, that stings. That's setting in. It stings, Derek. Yes, it's me too. Yeah.
Everything have to do everything.
It's good.
Kind of like life lesson. I know that sounds
Yeah.
weird, but when you're in production, this is no worse thing. Just the reality of life. You just start doing stuff and cast things, you're then open possibility. My kids.
Yeah.
About my wife. It's like
Yeah.
when you procrastinate on all the things, fill your brain space.
Yeah.
You actually never get good. So
Yeah.
God calls it whole life. Because when you're doing that whole life, it's like actually there is a lot of time to do that I want to.
Yeah. Yeah. Great. I love it. Thanks for sharing. Well, let's call it there. Let me stop the recording and let's just have people pray. We'll wrap up.